When I was 16 years old, my mother moved me and my brother from New York City to a small town in Michigan. The move itself wasn't too hard, and although I was upset to leave my small group of friends behind, I was excited that I would be able to have my own room for the first time. Being the new girl, everyone in my new high school wanted to be my friend and hear everything about how glamorous New York was. Spoiler alert, it wasn't. It was expensive. The schools were chaotic with too many students and too few teachers, and there were rats and cockroaches in every apartment I had ever lived in. But, wanting to be liked, I made my home state sound better than it actually was. In return, my new friend group, a group of 5 or 6 girls, told me everything about their town and the school I was then attending. Besides a girl named Susie having gone missing late last year, the town was safe, and the kids had more freedom to roam after hours than I did back in the city. So when I was invited to my first slumber party, my mother didn't have to think twice like she used to, and felt comfortable letting me attend the party. I was so excited. I remember getting to the girl who was throwing the slumber party's house about an hour before I needed to be there. But the girl was nice, and spent that hour showing me the yearbooks from middle school of her and my other new friends. By the time the others arrived, I was relaxed and enjoying myself. We did the typical things girls do at slumber parties. Watch movies our parents would never allow us to, eat as much junk food as we could, and of course, we talked about our crushes at school. Eventually, we grew bored with gossip, and the party girl had an idea to play a game she called Confessions. Basically, everyone wrote a confession on a piece of paper and put it into the emptied snack bucket. Then, she'll mix them all around, and every girl would pick a confession to read out loud, but not know who wrote what confession. The first couple confessions were normal. One girl stole her mother's credit card to buy a handbag she really wanted, and another girl confessed to having a crush on her brother's best friend. When it came time for me to pick my confession, I was still smiling from how much fun I was having, but the smile instantly fell from my face when I read what one of the girls had confessed. The confession, 3 words that made my heart stop. I killed Susie. I didn't read the words out loud, too confused about what I was reading and not knowing who Susie was. But then, I remembered the girls telling me about a girl who went missing last winter, about how she disappeared one night while at a party, a slumber party. I was shaking at that point, but one of the girls got tired of waiting for me to say my confession, so she took the paper out of my hand and read the words out loud without stopping to understand what she had just read. The room was so silent, you could hear a pin drop. Then, everyone started yelling and freaking out. A couple of the girls thought that it was a cruel prank that was being played, while the other girls demanded to know who wrote the confession, because they believed what the writer wrote. Me? I was staring at all of them, wondering which of them might be a killer. The girls calmed down soon after, and they all pretended like one of us didn't admit to being a murderer. And me, a teenager who didn't want to lose all her new friends because she freaked out and went home, I stayed the night. But I didn't sleep. I stayed up the whole night, wondering if Susie was actually killed, if the killer was actually in the room, if I was even safe. New York never seemed safer until that moment. The next morning, the girls didn't mention the game of confessions, and after we had a quick breakfast, we all went home. But I couldn't stop thinking about that note I read, no matter how many times the girls assured me it was a prank, and eventually, I drifted apart from that group. I made a couple of other friends that weren't as popular as my old friends, but they soon became my found family. But that didn't stop me from watching my old friends through the school day. When I was a kid, roughly 9 years old, my best friend, Lena, moved away for her dad's job. It was only about 20 miles away, but as a kid, that seemed forever away. After they settled in, I was asked to go to their house for a sleepover. I was so excited. I had spoken with my friend on the phone, and she told me that she thought the house was haunted. I didn't really believe her, as I thought ghosts were just something made up to scare kids. My mom drove me over with an overnight bag and dropped me off. The house was really nice, bigger than the one they used to live in. It was great seeing my friend again. When it was time to go to bed, Her mom came in and tucked us both in. We stayed up talking and giggling, trying not to be heard by her parents. Eventually, we heard her parents going to bed. They looked in on us and we pretended to be asleep. Once we knew they were gone, we started talking again. We had a torch that we shared and told scary stories that we were making up on the spot. My friend told me that they had a ghost that came into the kitchen and ate their food and biscuits. I laughed, obviously, while my friend swore to me that she was telling the truth. We stayed up a bit longer talking, and I heard a noise coming from the kitchen. Lena looked at me. "What is it?" I told her I thought I heard something from the other room. "See, I told you. Follow me and I'll show you." I crept downstairs with Lena leading the way, and lo and behold, there stood a woman in the kitchen eating food right out of the packet. "See, now do you believe me?" I was frozen. I was the same age as Lena, but I knew that this wasn't a ghost. This was a real person. The woman looked round at us. She must have heard our voices or something. She screamed and threw a packet of food at us as we turned to run away screaming. Lena's parents both came running out, asking what was going on. Lena told them there was a ghost in the kitchen, while I argued it was a woman. Her parents didn't believe the ghost version of the story either, and her mom took us to her room while her dad looked around and checked the house. The front door was still locked, but he noticed the basement door was open. He called the police, who came and did a full sweep of the house, but found nothing. We don't know where that woman disappeared to, but Lena said she continued to hear noises throughout the night for years to come, but never saw her again. When I was 12, I had a best friend named Elizabeth, but I just called her Lisa. Not a weekend slipped by that we weren't at each other's house. It was our normal until we reached high school. In high school, our personalities began to switch. While I was busy doing normal teenage girl things, like being boy-crazed and buying makeup that turned me orange, Lisa was focused on more morbid things. I watched her replace all the colors in her wardrobe to drab blacks and ripped jeans. Don't get me wrong, that's all fine. It was the personality shift that accompanied it that was the main concern. One weekend, Lisa invited me to a sleepover that she was throwing at her house. She had mentioned briefly that 2 of her other friends would be there, whom I didn't know well at all. But desperate to not let our friendship falter anymore, I said I'd be there. I thought that if we could just hang out like we used to, we could make things right again and go back to how they'd been. After school, my dad drove me to her house and saw me to the door. If my dad would have looked a little closer, he would have seen that there were no cars out front. The chaperoned sleepover wasn't chaperoned at all. Not wanting to appear like a snitch, I ignored it and walked in. Greeting me on the sofa was Lisa and her friends. 2 of them I knew as juniors. Their names were Raven and Draven. No, that isn't their real names, but to be honest, I never found out their real names. Then, in the recliner, was another guy I had never seen before. He looked older, way older. He had the sides of his head shaved, and the mohawk that was supposed to be sticking straight up laid limply to one side. He wore pants that were adorned with chains, and a fishnet long-sleeve shirt over a black tank. I did my best to avoid eye contact, and play things off cool to avoid making a fool out of myself. When I got closer to the unknown guy, I noticed the smell of cigarette smoke was emanating from him. It was nauseating. All of them had this distant look in their eyes, like the lights were on but nobody was home. I felt like I should turn around and walk out. Forget looking weak. The atmosphere was oppressive and dim. I wanted no part of it. Nobody spoke to me when I first arrived besides Lisa. The others were too busy in their own conversation. I could feel their eyes sizing me up to see if I would be able to fit in with the cool kids, when I heard a gruff voice pierce through the teenage giggling. Even talking, he didn't sound like he was our age. He sounded like a grown man. Feeling a bit more self-conscious, I watched as Lisa walked to the kitchen and came back holding beer. Confused, I just blinked a few times. Lisa had never mentioned alcohol before, so this was new. And while looking at her, the man took time to set up a game board on the floor. It didn't stick out to me until I noticed it wasn't a game board, or at least a friendly Monopoly game. It was a Ouija board. My brain started whirring 1,000 times a minute. I had never personally played with one, but my parents were strongly against them. I didn't quite understand the point, considering it was sold at Books A Million. Surely they wouldn't sell toys to talk to demons. As soon as he was done making sure it was ready to go, everyone's face lit up, except mine. I can't explain the feeling that came next, just that it was not welcome. I stayed rooted in my spot as they all set about lighting candles and pulling curtains. Not eager to get involved, I stayed back on the couch while they shifted on the floor. As any teenagers, they gave me grief for not partaking, and dumbly, I gave in. With 2 fingers from each of us placed on the wooden and glass triangular piece that I know now as a planchette, we began. It wasn't until the start that I learned the man's name was Weasel, and I was right. He was a man. He was 26. Why he was hanging out with 15-year-olds is a whole different type of horror story, but I digress. He was the one who started asking the questions. To start with, they were harmless questions. Is anyone there? Are we alone? Stupid stuff that everyone asks, but slowly it turned more sinister. Weasel's questions turned into direct questions about darker beings. One question asked for a harbinger of darkness. It was all around strange. Everyone else seemed to love it. It was during one of the questions on harbingers that the planchette began to move slowly. I went to jerk my hand away, which caused all of them to scream at me to put my hands back down. I did, but only because I saw fear flash in their faces. I knew I wasn't doing it, but I began to question if one of them was behind it to freak me out. I watched it glide effortlessly around the letters D-E-A-T-H. Everyone looked at each other smiling, and caught up in the moment, I forgot the question he asked was what the harbinger was a messenger of. The answer was death. It continued to circle the letters repeatedly. Weasel continued to ask more from it. How do we know this is real? Death for who? Your own death? If something's there, prove it to me, or else this is stupid and you're too weak, or it's just a joke. I felt myself flinch as he continued to become more aggressive towards whatever was happening. While I didn't want to believe it, I watched enough ghost shows to know that poking a sleeping bear wasn't a smart idea. To my horror, after the last statement, the planchette froze. It didn't freeze over anything, just stopped. It freaked out the others too, judging by how they all tensed. Our hands stayed frozen on the board for what felt like an eternity, until Weasel became fed up and removed his fingers. One of you had to do all that. There's no way something powerful would ignore me. Nobody ignores me. Assuming it was safe, since the ringleader moved his fingers, everyone else went to do the same. I was the last one with fingers still on it. I thought I was imagining it, but I felt the board move. It was subtle, that if you weren't touching it, you'd never know. I was in the middle of debating whether to follow everyone and move my fingers or just wait it out. I was too lost in my own thoughts that I didn't notice Weasel leaning forward on hands and knees to snatch the board from under my hands until I was forced to notice. I didn't have a chance to react before the board that had been under my fingers was no longer there. I watched in awe as the board came up and shot right by Weasel's face, hitting the wall with a thud and then falling to the floor. Everyone yelped except for me and Weasel. I was still in the throes of processing, and Weasel just developed a wide grin. It was like he witnessed the coolest of magic tricks. Weasel didn't even have time to make a move to the board before I felt a cold chill on the back of my neck. I was shaking by now. The air felt like it had been sucked out of the room as the candle we had lit went out. I don't know who it was, but someone gripped my hand for dear life. Weasel, who just didn't know when to shut up, started saying that whatever just happened was weak. It was a practical scare everyone had seen. Lisa and the other 2 were telling him to shut up. Weasel made his way and flipped the lights back on, pointing back to the board and telling us to put our hands back on it. No one wanted to, and stood firm in the resolute no. He was angry. Then his anger turned toward things unseen in the room He continued to belittle the air and yell cuss words left and right. This went on for 2 whole minutes. Then, it stopped. Weasel let out a groan and grabbed his stomach. None of us had time to reach him before he was on the ground and twitching. With the lights on, we could see his fists were in a ball and his eyes had rolled back to show the whites only. Lisa was freaking out, so it took me moving from safety to call for an ambulance. They told us to make sure nothing was around him that could hurt him, so I pulled everything away from him. He continued to writhe even after paramedics came. Those fellas were going in circles, running wires all over him until they could manage to lift him onto the bed and wheel him out. Not even caring about the friendship, I called my parents to come get me. I didn't care that I was going to be grounded for life. I just wanted to get out. It wasn't until later that I realized a major issue. We never said goodbye on the board. For months after I contributed any bad luck to whatever we made contact with that night. As for Lisa, she was grounded for having an adult man at her house and throwing a party without telling her folks. I heard that they said Weasel's seizure was from the medication he was on and the alcohol combination. Medically, it makes sense. I don't buy it though. I think he just pissed off the wrong force, and that was its way of showing it wasn't weak.